Right, so let's open up here. Oh, hang on. Start my slideshow.
Yep, that's lovely.
Present. Yay. Do bear with folks. Ah, there we go. Lovely. Right. Yeah, ladies and gents, just I'd just like to thank the Dickens Fellowship as well as Sati and Paul for being so helpful and kind and allowing me to present my research on this subject tonight. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to share it with you. And I do hope that you end up emerging from this talk as enthused with the National Sunday League and the work of Dickens and his colleagues as I am. So if anybody's on Twitter and they don't get the opportunity to ask any questions this evening, you're most welcome to find me. My little Twitter handle is at the bottom of the screen. Now, I suppose let me start by telling you how I initially came across the National Sunday League. Now, back in January 2018, I was having a wander around Islington St Pancras Cemetery, which happens to be well, it used to be my home cemetery, such as it was at the time. It was the one that was closest to my home. And I came across a memorial, which I'll quickly share with you. Please forgive my photographic skills. They're lacking somewhat in the respect that the picture on the right is slightly pixelated. I came across this relief on a headstone, and I was stopped dead in my tracks because it was so beautifully executed. The detail in it is absolutely superb, and I just think there's just something about it that I had to stop what I was doing and just read the inscription below. It was when I got to the part that said the National Sunday League, I thought, oh, hang on, who are these people? Because they sound like a superhero guild. And I suppose if you want to look at it that way, that's exactly what they were. Their aims and objectives were to essentially open up museums and places of cultural interest to the working classes on a Sunday, which was traditionally the Lord's Day, in the face of Sunday Observance Act. And many groups that championed preserving the sanctity of the Sabbath. So they faced an enormous amount of opposition. And let me get to my next slide. What I will do is I don't know whether you can read it actually on the first one, but about 2/3 of the way down, the inscription at the bottom of his headstone, Robert Morell's headstone, that is, he was the founder of the National Sunday League. It reads, his prolonged and arduous labours secured in 1896 the opening of the National Museums and Art Galleries on Sunday. And this was an exceedingly big deal, and it's something that Dickens and all of his, oh, bless you. It was something that a lot of his colleagues and co-workers and friends supported too. It was the idea of a continental Sunday. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I suppose the best way to start off by putting things into context. Context is my favorite C word in history, because without that, you don't have a scene to be said. So what I'm going to do is quickly go to my little illustration here. This is an illustration taken from Francis Trollope's The Life and Adventures of Michael Armstrong, the factory boy, rather. Francis Trollope, she doesn't have anything to do with this particular talk. I just really liked this illustration because I think it shows quite nicely the conditions that people worked in. You can see the lady with the really ragged clothing, and the story is about Michael Armstrong, who leaves the working in the textile mills and gets looked after by a gentleman who takes him on, I guess, as a son. I've not read the work myself, to be fair, and then ends up going back to the textile mills. And it was actually as a result of some investigative journalism that Francis Trollope did back in 1832 in visiting these textile mills in Manchester and looking at the condition of children labouring away. And I just use this slide to demonstrate the fact that at the end of the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th, obviously England, as the Industrial Revolution progressed, England dominated the rest of the world in terms of her economic output and growth. And as a result, a lot of people living in a lot of major large cities ended up living in very cramped and unsanitary conditions. The conditions have been basically substantiated by documents like Edwin Chadwick's The Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Classes of Great Britain. You also had other documentation like Engels's Condition of the Working Classes in England. Now, what are these pamphlets and other similar ones of their type did was reflect the suffering that the working classes experienced, in that, including children, that most of them worked 6 days a week, often for 12, 14-hour shifts, sometimes more. People got paid incredibly meager wages, and these were only paid to people on a Saturday evening. So, of course, this left very little time the following day, which was the Lord's Day, to actually do anything that you needed to do, for example, shopping or exercising or anything that involved recreation. The idea was that you had to go to church, and in church you stayed. So, let me just... I've got couple of notes I'm referring to because this is an enormous amount of information. So excuse me as there's more of my little aid memoirs. So at the end of the late 18th century, you saw advocates of the Sunday Observance Act basically championing having that day used to preserve, or rather preserving the sanctity of that day by not indulging in any recreation or any sales of food or anything such as like that. They had some pretty influential supporters, including people like, and I'll get to my next slide, people like Bishop Baleby Porteous. He's the picture in the centre with the red chair in the middle of the slide. You also had people like politician and abolitionist William Wilberforce, who's in the smallest circle on the presentation. You had writer and philanthropist Hannah More, she's bottom right, I beg your pardon. And they also even had King George III, all of whom were incredibly supportive of the Sunday Observance Acts, such as they were. And by 1825, this act had been in place for 200 years. But you might be wondering, what exactly was the act? It was a law that restricted recreational and trading activities to preserve the sanctity of the Sabbath. Now, I'm just scrolling down a bit, bear with. So by the 1820s, you saw the emergence of a movement that was known as, sorry, I beg your pardon, it's an alarm on my phone. You saw the emergence of a movement called the New Sabbatarians. And what they had done is take over the baton of their predecessors, being the evangelical revival, in terms of they had an incredibly literal translation of the Bible. And you can see the fourth commandment on the screen in front of you. Their ideals were very much based on everything within this. And I'll just read it very quickly to you. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath day of the Lord thy God, and in it thou shalt not do any work. That's from Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. So they had a very, very strict and very literal interpretation of this. No work was to be done, and this was enforced by law. It was in fact the 1781 Lord's Day Act that imposed fines on anybody caught working or selling things on a Sunday. Just to give you an idea of some very influential people who supported this also, the Bishop of London, Charles Blomfield. In 1830, he wrote a pamphlet. It's rather long-winded, the title. It's just a truncated version, believe it or not. Letter on the present neglect of the Lord's Day, addressed to the inhabitants of London and Westminster. And in this pamphlet, he basically went guns blazing at anybody who was caught working or, even considered working on the Lord's Day. So you had people like gin shops, you had wine shops, tradesmen, butchers, confectioners, bakeries. Sunday newspaper circulation was another one. Even selling alcohol, that was an absolute no-no, because that was equated with criminality. And as I say, this was enforced in law. I came across this wonderful example in the British Newspaper Archive. It concerns a man by the name of George Horney, that's Horney. He was a Ratcliffe Highway cheesemonger, and he had somebody by the name of John Bryant broke into his premises and stole a pig's head. This happened to be on a Sunday. Now, John Bryant himself was sent for transportation for 7 years as punishment. But poor old George, it must have been quite a bittersweet victory for him, because his expenses were denied back to him as payment in the court case on the grounds that, and I quote, his serving on the Sabbath at an hour not authorized by law or custom. So yeah, it was very, very strictly enforced. So let's go back to the bishop's letter. He also admonished Sabbath breakers, or gaily dressed Sabbath breakers as he called them, for doing things like travelling on pleasure steamers up the Thames. He also took aim at Sunday circulation of newspapers again, dinner and card parties, absolutely forbidden on a Sunday, and other recreational activities like that. And finally, ball games in Green Park during church service. You might think this is a little bit harsh if you're looking at this through a 21st century lens. But back in the day, the church dominated people's lives. So I just want to go to a little newspaper article, again dug out from the wonderful British Newspaper Archive. This is taken from the Preston Chronicle on the 13th of August, 1831. And it details 2 young boys who were caught playing ball on last Sunday. I'll just read 2/3 of the way down. In terms of the act against Sabbath breaking, a fine of 3 shillings and 4pence each within 1 week, in default of which they would be placed in the stocks. The chairman said, with reference to this case, that the practice of playing ball and other games during divine service had become so frequent and so annoying to the well-disposed community, and was moreover so conducive to the collection of crowds, not only of players, but of spectators, that the magistrates were determined to punish all similar offenders who should henceforward be brought before them. He hoped the present conviction, therefore, would prove a warning to others to desist from a habit so idle and so demoralizing in its effects. They were kids being kids. I actually went on the wonderful National Archive to see what 3 shillings and 4pence would have been in 1831. It turns out to be £11 in today's currency. It doesn't sound like a huge amount, but if you were working class and you were a child, that was an absolute fortune. So yeah, it may seem somewhat harsh, but wait till you hear the fines they gave to other people. I'm going to take you to my next slide. So I'll get to the pictures in a second, but other fines were imposed on adults. For example, any Sabbath breaker caught hosting entertainments was fined up to £200 a day. Anybody caught managing amusements or chairing a debate, you were fined £100 per day. And anybody caught selling tickets to either of the above was fined £50 a day. Now again, thanks to my the wonderful National Archive, bear with. Thanks very much to the National Archive currency converter. This actually equates to, I think it was the sale of 19 horses. It amounts in 2017, by the way, to £17,222.90. That was £200 in 1831. So for that amount, you could buy 17 horses. You could buy, I think it was 40 head of cattle, 220 bales of wheat, and I think it was 300. It would also equated, if you look at the circle here, this is a Bank of England pound note. And this is what struck me too, is that £200 in those days was the equivalent of 1,333 days of skilled labourer's wages or an artisan's wages. It was a huge sum of money, just to put that into perspective. Now, what made me smile too is not even royalty was immune from this Sabbatarianism criticism. William IV, he hosted a public dinner party on a Sunday during the meeting of the Society of the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, so itself a Christian organisation, and the papers tore him apart for doing so. So royalty was not immune either. Now, at this point, you might be wondering what drove the support of this act. It was fairly simple. It was a belief that Sunday trading and recreation equaled immoral behaviour. It was also looked on as being a corruption of principles. And it also was viewed in certain quarters as being a widening of the perceived chasm between God and the working classes. So people felt the need, the Sabbatarians felt the need to enforce this incredibly stringently. Now, the good old Westminster Review, they retrospectively blasted Bishop Blomfield's pamphlet addressed to the inhabitants of London and Westminster. They called it, and I quote, "an attack against the innocent and healthful Sunday pleasure-takings of the thousands and tens of thousands to whom pleasure-taking, except on a Sunday, is a physical impossibility." But again, this goes back to what I mentioned to you earlier. Sunday was the only day that people could actually go out and do anything that didn't involve working 14-hour shifts or 16-hour shifts. So people were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea with regard to this. However, the bishop's letter, or pamphlet rather, I stand corrected, also resonated with the Sabbatarians. And shortly after he published this pamphlet, you saw an organisation called the Lord's Day Observance Society, which was founded in 1831 by a guy called Joseph Wilson. Now, I'm bringing them up because they proved to be the arch nemesis of the National Sunday League. The two sides hated one another because obviously they had such incredibly opposing views. By the way, incidentally, if I am speaking too quickly, just to let you know, I suffer from unbridled enthusiasm. So if I do speak too quickly at any point, please do raise your hand or have somebody basically jump in and tell me to slow down. Anyway, when I presented my essay, to a fellow colleague of mine who also happens to be a Victorianist, one of the things he said to me was, "Sam, tone it down, love. The language used between the Sabbatarians and the Lord's Day Observance Society, it's very, very combative." And I had to say to him, they were combative. They hated one another. They were, as I say, they were just two complete opposite sides of the coin. And you'll see how they ended up having these battles a little bit later on. So let's get to my next slide. Oh, incidentally, the Lord's Day Observance Society, who I'll refer to from hereafter as the LDOS, I suppose they were what we would today call a single-issue political lobby group. So their objectives, again, as is becoming abundantly clear, was to basically preserve the sanctity of the Sabbath, purely dedicated to religious observation, as well as the other thing they encouraged their members to do was to submit to Parliament petitions to adopt legislature to enforce this even more. So, I mean, it's already strict, but they wanted to make it stricter. So, very much like the Bishop Blomfield, they were fueled by the belief that England's moral fibre was going to be damaged because of the Sunday openings and frequenting of shops, public galleries, pubs, tea gardens, travel, anything like that, anything to do with relaxing on a Sunday, absolutely forbidden. So in 1832, they went on the offensive and they attempted to close a lot of public places, such as the Zoological Society's gardens in Regent's Park. They were overruled by a majority for that, incidentally, but they did manage to succeed in closing the Royal Botanical Society's gardens. Now, they also found a champion. His name was Sir Andrew Agnew, and he was an MP. And he, over the next few years, attempted to pass 4 very stringent laws through Parliament in order to, substantiate and make their bill become law. It got quite heated in Parliament, actually, with this, because in 1836, you had good old Andrew Agnew, as well as radical MP Joseph Hume and Thomas Wakeley, who was the editor of the Lancet Medical Journal. In 1836, they had a sort of a verbal fisticuffs, if you will, in Parliament. It was at a meeting at the Committee of Supply meetings. And during this, Andrew Agnew turned around and was so enraged about the fact that both Hume and Wakeley were trying to champion the opening of the British Museum on a Sunday, that he turned around and actually threatened to vote against monetary grants being given to or dispensed to any institution opening on a Sunday. So you can see they were pretty hard line about it. They weren't messing around in terms of their threats. So let's get to my next slide, shall we? So here we have a picture of somebody, well, you probably do recognize. The Sunday Question, as it was known, it ignited the wrath of a young man who at the time of the LDOS's inception was working as a parliamentary reporter. The man was Charles Dickens, and just shortly after the serialization of the Pickwick Papers, that was in March of 1836, he published a pamphlet under the nom de plume of Timothy Sparks, which you can see a copy of on the right of this slide. It was entitled Sunday Under 3 Heads. And I love, there is a level of sarcasm here, which I thoroughly appreciate. He dedicated the pamphlet to the Bishop Blomfield, and he also used the pamphlet to savage Andrew Agnew's proposals to go through Parliament to make these strict Sunday observance laws even stricter. He basically highlighted the followers of the LDOS as fanatics, and something he pointed out in addition to that was highlight the hypocrisy of a bill that would essentially allow the rich to do as they pleased, and clamp down and inflict fines on poor people who are already struggling. So you can really see that interest in social justice emerging, right, even at that age. Well, I don't know how old he was then, actually. That's something I'd like to check in with anybody after the talk. But in addition to that, he also drew attention to the fines imposed on the offenders guilty of Sunday travel. They also targeted inebriation, they targeted driving cattle, public meetings, pretty much anything, again, that took place on a Sunday you could not do. So he labelled it, and I quote, an egregious specimen of legislative folly, and addressed the detrimental effect that the bills would have on the health and the happiness of the working classes. So let me move down just. There's actually an excerpt here that I'd like to read you, if I may, because I think it very succinctly crystallises the thrust of the pamphlet as a whole. Why, if the British Museum and the National Gallery and the Gallery of Practical Science and every other exhibition in London from which knowledge is to be derived and information gained were to be thrown open on a Sunday afternoon, I should like to see the time when Sunday might be looked forward to as a recognised day of relaxation and enjoyment, when every man might feel, what few men do now, that religion is not incompatible with rational pleasure and needful recreation. Again, I think that pretty much sums it up. So what I wanted to show you very quickly too, let's skip to the next slide. In 1843, this is a cartoon from one of my favourite publications, Punch. And this particular slide refers to an exhibition that the government basically wanted to throw open. It was a free exhibition of Westminster Hall, and they wanted to open it up to the public, but of course Punch jumped in there, and rightly so, basically said, sorry, do forgive me, I have a little title here that I just like to refer to. They kind of took a swipe at it on the grounds that the subsidy should have been spent on the bare necessities of life, saying the poor ask for bread and the philanthropy of the state accords them an exhibition. So I just thought that was a wonderful take on it. So let's skip through to the next slide. My next slide is just a lovely painting. It's Turner, and it's entitled, bear with, Rain steam speed. So this slide leads us very nicely into the rise of rational recreation. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it was an ideal pursued by the middle classes to provide healthier, more controlled alternatives to recreational activities of the working classes that basically promoted the benefits of fresh air, exercise, and education. Now, one very prominent supporter of this was good old Edmund Chadwick. Remember him from the report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population of Great Britain? Well, he actually observed, while providing evidence at a select committee for drunkenness in 1834, that a number of people observed heading to a Chartist meeting instead were diverted when the authorities opened up the zoo and the museum, just to basically distract the attendees of this particular meeting from attending the meeting. So he recognized that there was something in this. Now, the perceived benefit of rational recreation was that they were wholesome activities that encouraged the working classes away from the lewdness of the music hall, drunkenness and fighting in public houses and other such unsavory habits. The problem was this: if the upper classes failed to lead by example, the ideal could never be, or it could never succeed, let alone be enforced in legislature. So, in 1844, the president of the Board of Trade, then it was William Gladstone, he introduced a game changer in terms of regulating the legislation for the railways. He introduced at least one daily passenger train that allowed the working classes to travel for a reasonable fare. Now, the result of this is that workers could obviously go and seek opportunities outside of the city in which they lived. It also offered people the opportunity to go out and pursue rational recreation activities like excursions to the seaside or excursions out into the country. And this is really important because this leads very nicely into the Great Exhibition. Now, what I wanted to do is show you my next slide. So here you can see the construction of it going up in Hyde Park. Now, the Great Exhibition was inspired very much by the 1849 Paris Exposition, which Henry Cole, who was then employed by the Record Office and a very staunch supporter of the arts and culture, he proposed the English equivalent by which all nations could contribute and basically show off their creativity and skill. And of course, he had the support of Prince Albert, who then was the president of the Royal Society of Arts. So the whole Great Exhibition was conceived, and they started to construct the Crystal Palace itself in Hyde Park. Now, it was at this point I want to try and just show to you the interference, courtesy of the Lord's Day Observance Society, that very nearly prevented the Crystal Palace from being built. The reason for this is because at this time, what they started to do was campaign against Sunday postal services, both the receipt and delivery of mail. And it was at this point where Charles Dickens actually picked up and renewed his criticism of the LDOS via household words. He basically targeted their attempts to curtail the Sunday postal service. And the reason this is so important is because if it were not for the electric telegraph, it would have had disastrous consequences on the tendering process and the construction of Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It may actually have tripped up the process entirely had it not been for the electric telegraph. So he fought back and wrote a wonderful article entitled Sunday Screw and Household Words. I'm going to just read an excerpt of it because I think it definitely does give you a taste of his thoughts on this. Sunday Screw. This little instrument, remarkable for its curious twist, has been at work again. A small portion of the collective wisdom of the nation has affirmed the principle that there must be no collection or delivery of posted letters on a Sunday. The principle was discussed by something less than a fourth of the House of Commons and affirmed by something less than a seventh. Having no doubt whatever that this brilliant victory is, in effect, the affirmation of the principle that there ought to be no anything but churches and chapels on a Sunday, or that this is the beginning of a Sabbatarian crusade, outrageous to the spirit of Christianity, irreconcilable with health, the rational enjoyments, and the true religious feeling of the community, and certain to result, if successful, in a violent reaction, threatening contempt and hatred of that seventh day, which it is a great religious and social object to maintain in the popular affection. And he went through the process that I quite like this actually, because he pays some homage to Rowland Hill, who obviously revolutionized the postal service. He said the preparation may be likened to that which is usually described in the case of the Egyptian sorcerer and the boy who has some dark liquid poured into the palm of his hand, which is presently to become a magic mirror. Look for Lord Ashley, what do you see? Oh, here's someone with a broom. Well, what is he doing? Oh, he's sweeping away Mr. Rowland Hill. Now there's a great crowd of people all sweeping away Mr. Rowland Hill. And now there's a red flag with intolerance on it. So you kind of get the flavour again of his feelings toward the LDOS and their equivalents, basically interfering with the postal service. Dickens' circle at this point also started writing about the Continental Sunday. In particular, at this point, I actually want to thank Paul Lewis for sharing this with me. He's a part of the Wilkie Collins Society. Paul, if you're there, hi. Thank you ever so much for sharing this with me, because I think it also demonstrates just the interest in Dickens' circle in this exact same subject. Wilkie Collins actually penned a plea for Sunday reform. Now, this was published in the Leader, which is a radical left-wing paper at the time, and it was published on the 27th of September 1851, so only a few months after he'd been introduced to Charles Dickens. And a short line of it says, "I, for my part, believe in the humanizing power of our pictures and our museums. Believe that a man may carry away from them thoughts which are worthy of Sunday and worthy of religion, or in other words, thoughts which are fit to be seen by his maker." So I think that also pretty much sums it up. So, moving swiftly on, construction of the Great Exhibition, or rather the Crystal Palace itself, began in August of 1850. And it continued through to May 1851. And the construction actually saw about 200 people a day pouring through into Hyde Park to see it. Not on Sundays, mind, they weren't allowed to do that. So its interior was decorated and embellished by architect Owen Jones. And it was gradually filled with treasures from all around the world. And it opened to season ticket holders. I believe that the cost was no, sorry, let's get back to that later. It was up to season ticket holders and exhibitors, and it was seen by about 500,000 people who poured into Hyde Park for the occasion. It was a thunderous success. Thomas Cook, actually, in fact, just pertaining once again to rational recreation, Thomas Cook, RIP, they actually organised excursions for people from all over the country to come and view the Crystal Palace. Apparently, you could get in for, I think it was £1 a head to come in and view it. They organised people from all over the country to basically come down. And also, if you might be wondering at this point how people actually found the time, bearing in mind what I told you about, people working 6 days a week, it was actually the 1850 Factory Act that allowed respite to, I think it was women of 18 and young people, but it forbade work for any reason after 2 p.m. on a Saturday. So that did give people a little bit of leeway to actually come and see it after the introduction of that piece of legislature. Now, after the Crystal Palace had its grand opening in Hyde Park, it was actually a thunderous success, as I mentioned, and then after that it was dismantled and moved to Sydenham Hill, where it continued to thrill audiences. They hosted things like, choral and orchestral performances, aeronautical displays, that sort of thing. However, here comes the LDOS again, and essentially what they had tried to do alongside other evangelical organisations by late 1852, started collecting signatures for a petition to have the gardens and the actual place itself shut down on a Sunday. And unfortunately, on this occasion, they succeeded. December 1852, the government decided to uphold George III's 1781 Sunday Observance Act, and they closed down the Crystal Palace. And it remained shut for many, many years. In fact, I'll get to one of the aims of the National Sunday League shortly, but it did involve opening up again of the Crystal Palace once more. So far it looked as though the Sabbatarians were succeeding. So let's quickly to the next slide. Oh, there we go. I thought I had this. There you go, the Crystal Palace in all its glory, looking wonderful. Can you imagine? I know everyone always says, oh, I'd love to fly back in time and go to the Victorian period, but I have to say, if I was a fly on the wall, this is one place I would love to have seen, and if I could go back in time, look at it, it's magnificent. Anyway, sorry, moving swiftly on. The next slide, again, forgive the pixelated appearance, but you can see people in a pub. Now that the British Museum, the National Galleries, and now the Crystal Palace was closed to the working classes on the only day that they could actually enjoy it, on a Sunday, anyone care to hazard a guess as to what the next popular alternative was that the Lord's Day Observance Society was going to target? Yes, it was the pub. Now, this was a pretty predictable place for Sunday observance pressure groups to go for. And in 1854, the government followed suit in this campaign by restricting the Sunday sale of booze. Basically anything after 2:30 in the afternoon and 6 p.m. in the evening, and then again after 10 o'clock. Pubs closing at 10. Oh, it sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, now what do you think happens, ladies and gents, if you deny a Londoner a pint after having worked a 6-day, 14-hour shift per day? You're going to have a bit of a problem on your hands. And this is precisely what happened in 1855. Now, a combination of the Wilson-Patten Act, which was aka the New Beer Act, and the equally restrictive Sunday Trading Bill of 1855, this basically forbade virtually all trading on a Sunday. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Londoners were basically furious at having their last remaining pleasure quashed. And this led to the 1855 Sunday trading riots. Now, this riot was instrumental because somebody who attended it was Robert Morell, who ended up founding the National Sunday League. Let's just go back to this. And again, this just highlights, and I love how this highlights the hypocrisy about how the rich could do what they wanted, but the poor weren't allowed to follow suit. As soon as these acts were being debated, posters began to appear all over the town, basically saying, and I quote, how religiously the aristocracy is in observing the Sabbath in Hyde Park, as they used to drive around in their carriages having a lovely Sunday stroll. And you had a lot of ballads that started popping up, lampooning the bill. There was one in particular that summed it up perfectly, and I love this. Forgiveness, it's very small, so I'm going to read you two very short verses of this because I think it sums it up rather succinctly. I wish all the fools who this act did propose had the long Sunday trading bill tied to their nose, a pump in their mouth and they'd find it no joke, with the dome of St. Paul's stuck bang right down their throat. Starve us on Sunday they're going to try. I suppose something else they will plan by and by, to crush the poor man and keep them forlorn. Don't you think old England wants to reform? So I thought that kind of gave up a really nice flavour. Now, anyway, rioting broke out in Hyde Park in 1855 as a result of this. It was known as the Sunday Trading Riots. Now, at this point, you might be wondering where the Church of England was in all this and what their stance was in all this. At this point, they waded in completely and started branding all the rioters as being troublemakers, and who were joined by, and I quote, artisans and ragamuffins. And they also accused some of the shop owners on that day who dared to set up stalls selling food and drink people who'd come to see all the fuss was about, of trying to poison the nation. The Church of England actually accused them of selling inferior wares, both in food and drink. So yeah, they really had a bit of a swipe. I suppose if you had to take that to court nowadays, that would potentially be liable, So, sorry, excuse me, let's be done. That's better. So, as I mentioned to you a moment ago, at this point, 32-year-old Robert Morell and his wife Jane had ventured forth and were actually observing the rioters in action in Hyde Park in 1855. Apparently, some of the protesters were chanting, go to church, which was directed at the upper classes, leisurely, riding around in their carriages around Hyde Park that afternoon. He was a working goldsmith and a jeweller, and he was very much into geography and astronomy, but unfortunately, he never actually got to see any of the specimens held at the British Museum because he couldn't. It wasn't open on a Sunday. So 4 years earlier, and again, this is going to loop back very nicely to the Great Exhibition, his company, who Robert Morell was employed by, had attempted to try and produce golden jewellery that could be exhibited at the Great Exhibition. The problem was they were unable to produce a standard that was high enough in order to basically be granted access. So what they had to do in order to get accepted was outsource Swiss, German, French, Danish, and Swedish craftsmen to help them get their standard up to scratch. Robert Morell was rather curious with all of this and thought, well, how is it that his European counterparts are quite so skilled, so much more so than the English counterparts trying to submit all this jewellery? And the answer was pretty simple. First of all, they received mandatory technical training, and second of all, they enjoyed a continental Sunday. What was a continental Sunday, you might ask? This was basically where museums and places of cultural interest and scientific interest in other European countries were happy to open up for all to enjoy on the Lord's Day. So obviously, his European counterparts had been taking inspiration for all of the wonderful items that they'd seen while they could do this. Now, Robert Morell got rather frustrated with this and thought, hang on, why don't we have a similar thing here that, that no similar Sunday intellectual pursuits available in England? And a couple of years later, in 1853, he actually wrote to the editor, Douglas Jerrold, of Lloyd's Weekly News. And what he proposed, bear with, was basically Sunday openings of the British Museum and the National Gallery, so that tradesmen might, and I quote, enjoy food for mind as well as the body. He originally signed the letter RMM, and it was dated and published, rather, on the 27th of November, 1853. Now, this is, I think, quite interesting because it refutes a very commonly held thought that I came across when researching this, that he was inspired only by the 1855 trading riots. I think he'd already had, I think the riots were a catalyst for action over an issue that he already felt very strongly about. So what did he do about it? He founded the National Sunday League. founded the League, who I'm going to refer to as just the League from here on. He founded it in the autumn of 1855, and he began to place the organisation began to place newspaper adverts advising people of their objectives, their aims, the rationale behind it, the ultimate aim being to basically champion the Sunday opening of obviously cultural institutions for the enrichment and the education of the general public. He also said that this had to happen on condition that it did not interfere or detract from people's religious observations on Sundays. So it was basically having the best of both worlds. Now, apparently the League sought to, and I mentioned this earlier, the League sought to repeal the law closing the Crystal Palace. And they sent out letters to the press signed on behalf of their organisation's chair, who was William Duffy, and the Robert Morrell, who was their honorary secretary. Now, they appointed Liberal Party politician Sir Joshua Walmsley as their president, and they held their inaugural meeting at Lancaster House on Duke Street near Adelphi, where supporting letters from many luminaries, including Charles Dickens, were actually read out aloud. Now, at this point, you might be wondering how they were all connected. I did a little bit of what I like to call Victorian LinkedIn. I think this is how they all knew one another. Robert Morrell, as I mentioned, was a jeweller and a goldsmith. And William Duffy, before he went to journalism, also happened to be a goldsmith. They must have known one another because they formed the organisation together. And then obviously with William Duffy being a journalist and Charles Dickens sharing the same Sunday observation views, they obviously had common ground in this, so hence the support. Now, very shortly after that, and again, this is where we can see Charles Dickens's interest in Sundays and how he perceived Sundays coming to the fore. Shortly after the foundation of the NSL, or the League, December 1855, Charles Dickens began the serialisation of Little Dorrit, which went through to 1857. In the book, he kind of takes aim, I guess, at the government legal system and debtors' prisons, and of course, we know that he had a personal experience with debtors' prisons and that his father had been sent to one. Now, I'd just like to, if I may, read to you just a couple of excerpts from Little Dorrit. This is chapter 3. It was a Sunday evening in London, gloomy, close, and stale. Everything was bolted and barred that could by possibility furnish relief to an overworked people. No pictures, no unfamiliar animals, no rare plants or flowers, no natural or artificial wonders of the ancient world, all taboo with that enlightened strictness that the ugly South Sea gods in the British Museum might have supposed themselves at home again. Nothing to see but streets, streets, streets. Nothing to breathe but streets, streets, streets. Nothing to change the brooding mind or raise it up. Nothing for the spent toiler to do but to compare the monotony of his 7th day with the monotony of his 6 days. Think what a weary life he led and make the best of it, or the worst according to the probabilities. What secular want could the million or so human beings whose daily labour 6 days in the week lay among these Arcadian objects, from the sweet sameness of which they had no escape between the cradle and the grave? What secular want could they possibly have upon their 7th day? Clearly they could want nothing but a stringent policeman. Mr. Arthur Clennam sat in the window of the coffee house in Ludgate Hill, counting one of the neighbouring bells, making sentences and burdens of songs in spite of himself, and wondering how many sick people it might be the death of in the course of the year. As the hour approached, the changes of measure made it more and more exasperating. At the quarter it went off into a condition of deadly lively importunity, urging the populace in a contact lens issue, hang on. Sorry about that. In a voluble manner to come to church, come to church, come to church. At the 10 minutes, it became aware that the congregation would be scanty and slowly hammered out in low spirits, they won't come, they won't come, they won't come. 5 minutes, it abandoned hope and shook every house in the neighbourhood for 300 seconds with one dismal swing per second as a groan of despair. Thank heaven, said Clennam when the hour struck and the bell stopped. Sound had revived a long train of miserable Sundays, and the procession would not stop with the bell, but continued to march on. Heaven forgive me, said he, and those who trained me, how I've hated this day. So there again, very, very obvious in terms of Dickens's thoughts on Sundays and the dreariness of it. In fact, I came across something very similar with, it was one of the, do you know what, sorry, my mind is going a million miles a moment, so I'll park that and get back to it. It had to do with another very well-known author. Anyway, there are another couple of paragraphs in which he goes on in Little Dorrit about the miserableness and general unhappiness that he experienced, as I'm sure hundreds of thousands of other people did as a result of the Sunday observance laws. Now, I want to quickly go to my next slide, if I may. Oop, I'm one behind. There you go. That's a copy of the front of Little Dorrit. Go to the next one. Now, while this was all happening at the same time during 1856, Duffy and Dickens again started to utilise household words to great effect in terms of championing less puritanically observed Sundays. There was an article that appeared in Household Words, which if you want to take this down to look at it yourself, you may. That's why I've put a screen grab of the date it was published. In it, they go through, I think, a 4-page letter about, it's called More Sundays Abroad. And basically it detailed, and I can't remember off the top of my head whether it was Dickens or Duffy at this point, forgive me, but it detailed their travels through Europe, because by this time, both of these men had travelled extensively through Europe, through France, through Germany. Duffy had wrote very favourably about the idea of a continental Sunday and he published these in Household Words, which were, I suppose, all the accounts later collected into a 28-chapter volume entitled A Tramp's Wallet. I believe that you can actually find this on the Gutenberg org if you want to read it yourself. In short, it just recounted all the times he spent in German and French beer gardens, theatres. He lectured very extensively on the subject, Duffy this is. And he also he was forced to defend a lot of the National Sunday League's ideas against accusations of attempting to force a continental Sunday onto the British populace. I wonder what these guys would have made of Brexit, by the way. Sorry, that's just a random thought. Anyway, the Continental Sunday was viewed by the more zealous Sabbatarians as a genuine threat, an attack on what it meant to be English. One rather indignant English visitor to Paris described having never before in one day witnessed so much of human depravity, because theatres and shops remained open in Paris at the time. It's a bit harsh. Now, in 1858, July, Lord Stanley, he presented a petition to the House of Commons. This was begging to remove the curtailment of Sunday openings of museums, etc., etc. Now, this time the signatures were absolutely mind-blowing. Oh, hang on, sorry, I've gone one too far forward. Park that there. So in addition to people like Charles Dickens, you had Charles Jr. and Alfred Dickens who also signed. You had a lot of Charles Dickens's colleagues and peers. Wilkie Collins signed it, William Makepeace Thackeray signed it. Who else? Goodness. You also had people like Charles Babbage. You had Charles Darwin who signed one of the first ones. The gentleman who designed and got all the interior of the Crystal Palace together, Owen Jones, the architect, he signed it. Henry Cole signed it. You have people like Herbert Spencer, John Stuart Mill. I'm not being funny or anything. Richard Owen, he's another one. You know, at that point he was the then professor of paleontology and director of the Natural History Department at the British Museum. So you literally had the who's who of Dickensian society in terms of academics and historians and all sorts. Famous artists like Charles and Edwin Landseer. Edwin Landseer, rather, I beg your pardon. They also signed it. Journalists. You even had Benjamin Travers. He was the surgeon extraordinary to Queen Victoria and the surgeon ordinary to Prince Albert. The list goes on and on and on. Now, I beg your pardon, I actually made a mistake when telling you who had signed it. Charles Darwin had not signed it. He had been sent through one, but he hadn't returned it in time for submission, probably because the publication on the origin of species was about to happen the next year, and I think, frankly, he had bigger fish to fry. So he didn't sign it on that basis, although he did send back his petition, but it wasn't submitted in time, basically. Writers, deadlines. Anyway, so in 1858, December, you had the National Sunday League and the Lord's Day Observance Societies. By this point, the relationship between the two had gone to an all-new low. They hated one another. I think, in response to anything that the National Sunday League did, and all of its supporters did to support Continental Sundays, you'd always have some fire back from the LDOS, always. In fact, when the National Sunday League first formed, the LDOS actually wrote to Queen Victoria herself to complain, like a kid. He said this. They complained that the National Sunday League were essentially trying to just ruin everything that they held dear, which I think is a little bit strong. But again, I suppose we look at this with a 21st century perspective and think, oh, it all makes perfect sense having these things open on a Sunday. So, in summer of 1860, and this is where we get to my next slide. On Sunday of 1860, the NSL pulled out the big guns. They wrote a memorial, in other words, a memo to Queen Victoria herself, Basically, it was incredibly similar to the memo that they'd submitted to Parliament 2 years earlier. Only this time it had more signatures from courtesy of, I mean, you had people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti sign it, Alfred, his brother, his name escapes me right now, bear with, William Rossetti, I beg your pardon, William Holman Hunt, and you had Egbert Jones, you know, people like that. In fact, out of the 920 signatures that they acquired for this particular petition, 25% of them were artists and sculptors. So now you don't have just the academics, now you've actually got the artists themselves coming forward and say, yes, yes, open up on a Sunday. Now, something I found really interesting about this was not just the people who signed it. And you can find both of these, by the way, online. If you go to the British Museum's, sorry, I beg your pardon, the British Library's archive, you can actually find digitized copies of both the petition to Parliament as well as the petition to Queen Victoria, in case anybody's interested. It really is. It's like reading a who's who of mid-1850s London. It's an amazing list. Anyway, so what I found interesting is not only the people who signed it, but also the people who didn't sign it. And like you had notable people that you thought might have supported such a cause, people like Angela Birkbeck Coots. Her name was nowhere on that, even though she was good pals with Charles Dickens. Her name wasn't on it because she held very strict religious beliefs. Somebody who also didn't sign it was Edmund Chadwick. I mentioned him on a couple of occasions earlier on. His name wasn't on that either. So I'd be very curious as to why he wouldn't support something like this. Now, you also had the support of George Holyoake, by the way. He was an ex-Chartist, and he published a letter in his secular The Reasoner in 1862. During that time, by 1862, the National Sunday League had basically, they'd had many small victories, but they were nowhere near winning the war. They had small victories in terms of ongoing campaigns to keep smaller museums open, but it didn't happen on a national level. You saw museums and galleries like the ones at Kew, the galleries in Hampton Court Palace, Greenwich Hospital and Dublin remained, galleries in Dublin remained open, but otherwise there remained and nothing had happened. Now, something else that the Sunday League also did was they started to re-implement Sunday bands programs in a lot of, London's parks, and continued advertising Sunday excursions, going back to the similar thread that I told you about with rational recreation. Again, if you go onto the British Library's online catalogue, you can find digitized adverts for the excursions to places like Margate, offering trips to the coast and to get fresh air, and they're lovely to read. So, where was I? Yeah, by this point, they began focusing on the Sunday excursions and London band openings and what have you. But the problem was they seemed to have lost their way. They seemed to have lost a lot of thrust and original passion that they'd had from the beginning of the inception of their organisation to pursue what they wanted to get done in the first place. It's almost as though they'd accepted that nothing was going to happen and sort of just carried on in the places that they were doing well in. There was a supporter and a member of the National Sunday League. In fact, he was a member of its council called Mark Judge. And in 1872, I think he thought that the organisation had pretty much run out of steam, so he decided to form his own. It was called, what was it called? Oh, the Sunday Society, I beg your pardon. It was formed in 1875, which coincided with the opening of the creation of the Westminster Aquarium, which, by the way, leads me to my next little slide. This is the aquarium here. I just thought I'd include this because the illustration is absolutely beautiful. I mean, you can see all of the people looking on and wonder at all of the, I think they're looking at a seal over there on the right-hand side. It's just such a lovely little piece of ephemera. So I thought I'd include it on that basis. Now, anyway, as I say, going back to Mark Judge, he formed the Sunday Society in 1875, and Judge basically became Morell's counterpart in the Sunday Society as the honorary secretary. And the new organisation later voted some further pretty influential people. I mean, you had people like William Holman Hunt, who signed the previous petitions, actually got on board with this organisation. Liberal Party politician John Tomlinson Brunner. And you also had people like the Duke of Westminster. So again, they had some pretty high up and rather influential people supporting this new party. And oh, by the way, and other people who included on signatories of the Sunday Society. This time, Charles Darwin got on board. He eventually got there and signed one of the petitions. Yay! He also had people like Professors John Tyndall and Thomas Huxley. The society was a lot more progressive than the National Sunday League in the respect that, they also welcomed female members onto the committee. And this is a bit of research that I'm working on when Paul very kindly introduced me at the beginning of the talk. It's a bit of research I'm working on in conjunction, hopefully, if all goes according to plan, with the Museum of London about Victorian and Edwardian women in museums, which I'm really pleased about. Very exciting. Anyway, let me quickly get to the next little bit that I need to tell you about. So the organisation of the Sunday Society, it basically was a shot in the arm. This new energy was absolutely pivotal in the latest success of the Sunday question. During this time, while this was happening, by the way, there were a couple of other unsuccessful parliamentary debates that supported the idea, which didn't go anywhere. Those happened in 1878 and 1891. Now, it's at this point where we look at the failure of the Sabbatarians, because we're coming up to the big finale, ladies and gents. The National Sunday League and all of its associated Sunday societies end up being victorious in 1896. One of the things that they succeeded in where the Sabbatarian organizations failed was unity. The Sabbatarians never joined forces. They only ever had one, shaking its hand and pointing its finger, etc., etc. They never thought to join. This is where the success of the Sunday League and the Sunday Societies came in. And it actually resulted from, I think it was the prosecution of 3 members of the, bear with, it was the Working Men's Lord Day Rest Association. They were 3 members of that, sorry, bear with me a second. Yeah, 3 Sunday League, sorry, I'll try that again. Do forgive me, I'm a little tongue-tied. I just get really excited about this. Basically, in short, the union resulted from the prosecution by the Working Men's Lord Day Rest Association of 3 Leeds Sunday Lecture Society members following their delivery of Sunday lectures. Now, what these arrests did was prompted all of the Sunday Observance Societies to join together. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them because there were hundreds of them. But obviously it included the National Sunday League and all of its supporters, Sunday Society. It was called the National Federation of Sunday Societies. So now they've joined forces. Now, it was at this point, after the unity of all of these societies, I think John Brunner, MP, said, regarded as being another instance of good coming out of evil. I really love the wording on that. As I say, they were pretty harsh with how they worded these sorts of things. In an October 1895, Mark Judge eventually provided evidence to a select committee on the Lord's Day Act in the House of Lords that would eventually see the culmination of all 40 years' worth of effort, campaigning, and everything else originally instigated by Robert Morell all those years ago. 40 years. So finally, on the 6th of March, 1896, a petition was presented to the House of Commons by Sir John Lubbock on behalf of the Society, basically supporting a Sunday opening resolution. This is where it gets, the success is in the air, ladies and gents. 178 voted in favour, 93 voted against. And on the 30th of March, 1896, First Lord of the Treasury of the House of Commons announced that the South Kensington and Bethnal Green museums would be the first to open to the public as soon as possible, with the British and Natural History Museums following swiftly afterwards. Hooray! So on very inclement weather, on it was Easter Sunday, I beg your pardon, on the 5th of April, 1896. First person to arrive outside the South Kensington Museum was Robert Morell himself. And at this point, he was 73 years old. He was issued with a complimentary pass, courtesy of the Committee of the Council of Education, was joined by a crowd of approximately 50 people, all of whom had been waiting very patiently, wearing their Sunday best, passed through the turnstiles to see all of the wonderful Turner watercolours and the porcelains and the earthenware and all the textile exhibits on display. There were police. They'd turned up just in case there was any trouble, but the police presence proved unnecessary. Everybody was on their absolute best behaviour and waited very quietly and expectantly. While at the same time, in East London, Mark Judge had headed over to open up, or go to the opening of the Bethnal Green Museum. So yeah, they had a number of visitors waiting very patiently outside there too. Now, what I love about this is the sheer numbers of people that flocked through. And I mean, bearing in mind, again, London was a much smaller place in comparison to what it is now. Within 3 hours, the South Kensington Museum saw throngs of people stream through the turnstiles, as did the Bethnal Green Museum. Unfortunately, 2 of the men who were pretty instrumental in the creation of the Great Exhibition and the South Kensington Museum, namely Henry Cole and Owen Jones, they both passed away. So they never got to see, you know, the realization of the very thing that they supported for such a long time, for the museums that they were actively involved in, which I think is terribly sad. In fact, many of the signatories on the Leeds petitions never got to see the culmination of all of the stuff that they championed. Charles Dickens was one of them. He passed away by that point. So did Thackeray, so did Wilkie Collins, Babbage, Rossetti, Darwin, Owen Mill, Knox. They were all dead. They never got to see the very thing that they'd so passionately championed. And I think that's a pity. Apparently, even Robert Morell, and there's a wonderful interview with him, a paper from 1896. Apparently, even he was slightly concerned at his advancing years that he himself wouldn't make it to actually see, you know, the gates open and everybody be allowed in. So just to wrap this up, I don't know if you're interested in hearing the stats of how many people came through on the first Sunday, but I'll make it very, very quick because I'm conscious of the time. South Kensington Museum, in a space of 3 hours, saw 3,173 people pass through its turnstiles. The National Gallery saw nearly 2.5. The Natural History Museum saw nearly 1,800. The British Museum saw nearly 1,700. The Bethnal Green Museum saw nearly 800 people, and the Geological Museum, very last on the list, saw 191 people pass through its. Move on to my final slide. Here you can see a couple of people wandering around in their Sunday bests in the North Court of the South Kensington Museum. Basically, since 2001, visitors have enjoyed free admission to over 50 museums across the UK on a daily basis. The issue of Sunday observance has never fully dissipated in the respect that it kind of carried over into the 21st century, I guess, with organisations like Keep Sunday Special, which is dedicated to restricting Sunday trading. And you had Day One Christian Ministries, which is the more balanced predecessor of the Lord's Day Observance Society. So, you know, I'm originally from South Africa, and I remember as a kid, you know, in the early 80s, of, you know, wandering around shopping places where we'd normally do our grocery shopping, and everything was shut. If you didn't get it done on Saturday, that was it. You had no food for Sunday. So, I mean, it has still, you know, continued into, you know, relatively modern history too. So, what time are we? Oh, just an hour. I apologize. I'm about 10 minutes over. Forgive me, everybody. Yeah, just to wrap it up, I do hope that you found this talk interesting. Thank you ever so much for you know, your kind attention, and any questions that anybody has, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you ever so much, everybody. I really appreciate you all signing up, and thank you so much for having me for the Dickens Fellowship. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
thank you very much. That was great.
Oh, thanks.
I think normally we get questions through via chat. I don't know if you've got any questions there. Can you see any, Sam?
I mean, if anybody doesn't have any questions at this moment, you're most welcome to send them via the Dickens Fellowship afterwards. If you think of anything, if nothing occurs to you right now, I'll do my best.
Sam, could you
yes,
the screen share, please?
Oh,
so
I beg your pardon.
We can see everybody, and they
Sorry,
can
I do beg your pardon. Hang on. There we go. Sorry about that.
All right. Right. So I suggest that people who have a question. Oh well.
There is one in the chat at the moment, so
Yes, okay.
Oh yes, there we go.
Yeah. If you open the chat.
That's actually a really good question, and I didn't have time to try and find out what she had said precisely, but I did come across a reference to her thoughts on the organisation. She was of the opinion that it was very much basically a bunch of middle-class people trying to not force their will so much, but not doing it because they wanted to. Or rather, sorry, let me try and rephrase that. Her opinion, as best as I can find, kind of suggests that she didn't think the organisation was doing it for the benefit of the working classes per se. She felt that they were doing it for the benefit of not promoting themselves, but kind of getting a gold star from her, if you will. I can't remember the source where I read this, and I have not been able to find the original citation, but I am happy to look for it if anybody's interested. Thank you. It's a good question, and that's the only account that I found of hers about what she thought about the National Sunday League. That's the only one. I'm sure there are more, but I just haven't found them. Oh, thank you, David. Yeah, Sunday Under Three Heads was in 1836, so Dickens was 24. Thank you for that. I had wondered, he was still relatively young then. Anybody else?
Raise your hand if you prefer, whichever you like.
Hello?
Oh, hello.
Hello. Yeah, I noticed that when you said about the museums opening, they were all in London. Have you any information about how this played out in the rest of the country?
The reason I'd focused on London is because this was based on an essay that I'd done for university, and the focus was London at the time. But shortly after that, museums over the country started to open up. It created a domino effect. So, shortly after all of the museums here opened up, you saw museums open up all over the UK, which was great.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
A question here on chat. Did they allow hangings on Sunday?
Do you know what? That's a really good question. I happen to have the history of capital punishment on my bookshelf. If anybody's tempted to go and look it up, actually. I don't know. I would imagine not.
No, they didn't. They definitely didn't.
Yeah.
They definitely didn't.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been doubly sacrilegious, wouldn't it? You can hang people and them have horrible death as long as you don't do it on Sundays. Then it's okay if it's 7 days, 6 days a week. Thank you, Tim.
There's another question here. You mentioned something about letting women participate in the League's committee. Could you say something about
Something.
Oh.
in all this?
They were very. It was actually the Sunday Society, so they were kind of the younger, more fired up version of the National Sunday League. They had started to let women onto the committee, one of which was Mark Judge's wife. And there was another woman's name on one of their committee papers that I came across. It's something that I'm currently exploring, working with the Museum of London about this, because they've expressed some interest in this particular topic. It's thanks to the wonderful Victoria Guide. I don't know how many amongst you are a member of it, but I've come across a couple of wonderful examples in literature of women going to museums and galleries in the late 19th century. So for me, it's a work in progress. I can't answer that at the moment because it's something I'm currently looking into. But if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to, share whatever research I find on it at a later stage. But for the time being, I don't know right now. That's a work in progress. I'm sorry I couldn't answer that.
Do we know if attendance at church suffered as a result of the opening of museums?
I think that was definitely a fear. I think that people were, particularly obviously the Sunday observance societies, I think they were definitely concerned that opening of museums would certainly draw people away from going to church. I don't think, it's a good question because I don't actually know the statistics, but I know that it was definitely a focal point of the Lord's Day observance societies and its contemporaries, and that it might draw people away from attending church, but I don't know whether they did or they didn't. It's a good question. It's one I can't answer, I'm afraid. But I know that they were definitely fearful of it.
Yeah, there's another one here, the last one here. Do you think Dickens would approve of our 24-hour trading laws today, bearing in mind lots of people have to work and so miss spending time with their families?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Gloria. I don't think you would. Because one of the things that the National Sunday League wanted to put forward, and Dickens said himself in Sunday Under Three Heads, was to have a balance. He wanted people to be able to enjoy their recreational time without interfering with their religious observance. So I'm not sure he probably would have approved of 24-hour trading laws, to be honest. This is again one of those questions where I should travel back in time and would it be a lovely thing? But I can't imagine he would have done.